Good evening and welcome to Dig This. My name is Tom Levy and I'll be your host. This evening my guest is Professor Charles Stanish from the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. Professor Stanish received his PhD from the University of Chicago and he is a leading expert on South American archaeology. Good evening, Chip.
Good evening, Tom. How are you doing?
Great. Chip, you're one of the anthropological archaeologists who focuses on the study of ancient civilizations. How does an anthropological archaeologist go about studying something that big?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that we are anthropologists, and we're not historians, or we're not looking for objects, we're looking for information. And as an anthropologist, we want to know not only kind of a thick, rich history of the ancient culture that we're studying, but we also want to know how that particular culture compares with others around the world of similar organization and time period. And so we want to know what are the processes that underlie the formation of these states. So as an anthropologist who looks at large regional problems, I begin with what we call a surface survey, and I go into a fairly large region and we try and assess the nature of all the archaeological sites in the area, get an idea of who was there when they were, how many sites, what they look like, and so forth and so on. Try to control for all the historical empires and other states that were there. And then we bring to bear a long-term research design that begins with regional surface coverage, small test excavations to refine chronologies and so forth, and worry about the different kinds of art styles that were in the area and try and peg those down to their time period. Then we go back to more intensive survey, and then we use that as the basis for more intensive excavations, ultimately answering the kinds of questions that we anthropologists are interested in.
Now, your first love was the Tiahuanaco civilization. That's one of the earliest world civilizations, is that correct?
In the Americas, it's one of the first, what we call pristine states, or first generation states in the New World. It goes back to around 500 AD, and it expands up through 900, maybe 1000 AD. It collapses for reasons we're not quite sure, but it might be associated with drought and popular rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Now, what got you interested in Tiahuanaco?
Well, I've always been fascinated by ancient empires, why they rise and why they collapse. And this is an age-old theme. It goes back, as you're well aware, to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. And it runs through the Renaissance and Enlightenment period. It's one of the age-old questions, as I tell my students. This is one of the ones that has tugged at the human soul for generations. Why do empires rise and collapse? So having an empire like Tiahuanaco that only lasted maybe a few hundred years at best, and we have good archaeological data in an area that is relatively untouched, allows us to study why empires do indeed collapse. I love Tiahuanaco as Tiahuanaco, its own cultural history, but I also love the fact that I can look at it for anthropological reasons.
Now, your work has focused on the greater Lake Titicaca basin. Mm-hmm. Why is that an important part of the civilization?
Well, the capital of Tiahuanaco is located in what is now the Republic of Bolivia on the far southern side of Lake Titicaca. The lake itself is quite huge. It's the 9th largest lake in the world. It's about 8,000, 9,000 square kilometers. It's pretty big. The culture area that Tiahuanaco and earlier and later cultures where they thrived is actually about the size of California. It's 400,000 square kilometers. It's massive. And just in the little area where I work is actually twice the size of Belize. It's 2 Belize's. So it's a really big area, and it is relatively unknown. Even up through the 1980s, we had very little archaeological research in the area for a variety of reasons, one of which is it's very high and cold. It's a little bit difficult to work there. And most Peruvian archaeologists who were studied in Lima focused on the coast. And you've heard of the Lord of Sipan and all the gold and all the tombs that we find, really spectacular archaeology there. And people have tended to focus in on the coastal or on the northern highlands near Cusco, the ancestral home of the Inca Empire. But here we had way down in the south, divided between 2 countries, which creates logistical problems, very inaccessible. We had this great center of New World civilization that had been relatively unstudied. There had been marvelous work before me, don't get me wrong, going all the way back to the 16th century, but in terms of systematic, long-term, comprehensive, it really was from people from the University of Chicago who began that in the 1980s.
So Your work was in the Lake Titicaca area, and I believe you focused on the island of the sun. Is that right?
That's one component. I first got there and I said to myself, okay, we have this knowledge of the lake region and the party line, so to speak. The dominant theory was that the lake was divided into these two great cultural regions, one in the north and one in the south being Tiahuanaco. And then it struck me that that was a bit simplistic from strictly a theoretical point of view. We look at things like peer-polity interaction and the nature of early state societies or right before states emerge, and we look at Europe or we look at Asia or we look at the Near East, Mediterranean. We see that it's rare when you have two cultural areas that go all the way back, that there usually is a period of very intense competition between these groups and lots of small political units allying with themselves and breaking with themselves and fighting and being friends and enemies and so forth. So I said to myself, I'm going to start right smack dab in the middle between these two, between the northern area.
The lake is in the middle? The island is in the middle?
Okay, no, I'm sorry, I'm getting to that. The island actually came a little later. And so I went in and I did a survey in the middle of these two culture areas, and indeed it did show that it was a bit more complex than we had originally thought. That led me to look at the island of the sun, which the historical documents told us was one of the great pilgrimage destinations of the ancient world for the Inca peoples. The question was the island of the sun a great pilgrimage destination for other empires like Tiahuanaco, for instance?
The earlier ones.
The earlier one, yeah. Inca being around 15th century to the, around the 15th century to the Spanish Conquest in 1530s. So we went to the island of the sun, my colleague Brian Bauer and I, and we surveyed the island. We did your standard 3-year project, multidisciplinary, multi-year project. And we came up with some very interesting and surprising results that showed that Tiahuanaco was the first to establish a pilgrimage center to the island, that the Inca came 500 years later and appropriated that, the great heritage of the Tiahuanaco peoples. And then, in fact, even before the Tiahuanaco peoples, the area was used as a ritual center. So what we have is, at around 200 BC, an island being used as a ritual, very important ritual destination. The Tiahuanaco people come in and formalize it into a small regional shrine of importance to the Tiahuanaco state. Then there's a collapse. The Inca come in, they actually go to the Tiahuanaco temple, crush it, put dirt over it, make agricultural terraces to make a point, and then they move the sacred location a little bit, about 150 meters away, and they establish their own temple that was dedicated to the sun and the founding Inca couple.
Now, if we go back to the Tiahuanaco and their use of religion in the construction of their state, let's say, just how central was religion in the formation of the early Tiahuanaco polity?
Well, let's say at the beginning we don't have historical documents for the Tiahuanaco, so everything is from archaeological evidence. We look at the pottery and we look at the stone carving and we look at some of the textiles. Having said that, what we find is that the symbols of the deities or gods or what have you go all the way back to an earlier culture called Chavin, to 500, 600 BC, even much earlier. And the Tiahuanaco used some of these. They reworked these symbols and myths into their own state religion. And people like me tend to take a theoretical perspective from Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, that sees the religion as being part of the strategies of empire building. So from that perspective, we see that the Tiahuanaco used these great symbols, pan-Indian symbolism, and then they used them as part of the process of their imperial expansion. So they would go into another area, they would say, okay, this is our territory, this is where the gods said that we belong, we have these symbols. You can take some of these symbols from us, you can use them, and that's reflected in the art and archaeology of the provincial territories. Not a complete suite of motifs, just a select group.
So are you suggesting that at the time of the Tiahuanaco state formation that there was a kind of world system, an ancient world system that existed?
I wouldn't go that far, to be honest. I would say that you have in first-generation states that we see, and I would go so far as to say there were 3 in the Andes, and they were relatively independent, Tiahuanaco being one of them. Yeah, Moche, the famous Moche being the first, the Wari being very close, and Tiahuanaco being very similar in time, all about the same time. I would say that the first archaic states in the Americas, and perhaps even around the world, would not fit world systems models as we know it. They seem to be much more of a Swiss cheese style archipelago, establishing enclaves, colonies in different areas, controlling trade routes, but not really expanding in a way that we understand world systems, where you make these other populations dependent upon you. It looks as if more like they move in, they establish garrisons, and they trade with local populations, maybe co-opt a few local elites to be part of this imperial system, but not anything like we would see world systems as applied to the modern period.
Well, you mentioned garrisons. Wouldn't that imply that they had armies that actually controlled these maybe less developed peoples on the periphery?
This is where I'm breaking a little with world systems. I see the garrisons and the armies not controlling people, but controlling strategic resources. And that the people seem to be either voluntarily incorporated into these, or their territory is taken away, but these people move away. And I'm not implying that there wasn't force, lots of force. But there's a big distinction between going in, taking a settled state system, taking it over, putting your administrators, and extracting wealth in the form of labor, versus establishing a garrison, maintaining your trade routes, and taking the strategic resources, in this case copper, gold, products from the tropical forest. Now, I say that because I have cases archaeologically from my survey where we have these two valleys. They're essentially next to each other, 5 kilometers apart. They have these canals and these raised field systems, which are ancient agricultural techniques. And we have a huge settlement that begins at like 700 BC and goes all the way up to the Inca conquest. And within that whole area, we have all these complex architecture. We have these raised fields. We have a completely independent hydrological system for agriculture. And we have the sunken courts and the textiles and all this stuff. And then you go right next door and you see the same thing, but it's full of Tiahuanaco. Now, this was not abandoned during the Tiahuanaco period. It couldn't have been. We have the carbon-14 dates that now strongly suggest that this was contemporary with Tiahuanaco. Yet, there's not a single Tiahuanaco shirt over here, not a single piece of Tiahuanaco material culture. It looks as if the Tiahuanaco came in, established their colony over here, using their own water resources so they wouldn't interfere with these others. They seem to have coexisted, either peacefully or otherwise, but this group was not taken over. They either traded with, maybe they went to parties with, they did feasting, and who knows. But Tiahuanaco did not create a province in the sense that we understand provinces, like the Inca Empire did later, like the Romans did, and so forth.
Amazing. So was there a kind of competition, but there wasn't a dominant group? You don't see Tiahuanaco as forcibly dominating the landscape?
Well, what I'm saying is that Tiahuanaco had the ability to take over anywhere they wanted, but unlike later empires, didn't have the ability to take over everything in a stepwise march of provincial territories, bringing in the army, putting the veterans, establishing new provincial territories, giving citizenship to certain people. They could pick and choose anywhere they wanted, and nobody could contest them because they were too strong. Remember, they were the first state. All these others weren't state-level societies. They couldn't really organize that amount of labor for military or other works. But Tiahuanaco could take whatever they wanted within a limited range, and they did that. And they chose a number of areas, and they seem to have always chosen areas that had good water on the road, that were on the trade system, that was strategically located and was defensible and close to the lake.
It sounds like Tiahuanaco had an amazing administrative network to hold all this together. Did they have evidence of writing or some sort of administrative artifacts?
We suppose that they had a form of the quipu that the Inca Empire had, that sets of knots in wool or cotton string that were extremely sophisticated and functioned in many ways like the cuneiform tablets of the Old World. They were administrative documents by and large, and you had special people in the Inca Empire called Quipo Kamayak, which were the keepers of the quipus, and they were the accountants of the empire, and they knew exactly what each of these threads meant, and they were distinguished by color and size and location on the thread. So they had that kind of administrative, but they didn't have actual writing as we know it. They just simply didn't need it.
So what do you think brought the Tiahuanaco civilization to an end?
Well, some scholars have suggested that there was a big drought around the turn of the millennium, AD 1000. Now, we know that to be a fact. We know that there was drought up in Mesoamerica. We know there was drought in the American Southwest, and we know that there was drought down in the Titicaca Basin as well. The question then becomes, is that the reason that the Tiahuanaco Empire collapsed? Well, following that logic, we had another drought at AD 750, right in the middle of their expansion, and they didn't collapse. So one can't simply use drought, in my opinion, to explain the collapse on one hand and explain the rise or the maintenance of the empire on the other.
Right.
So drought does appear to have been an important factor, but one factor of many that appear to have come together at the same time. We do have linguistic evidence that suggests that there were migrations of new people coming in the wake of Tiahuanaco collapse. And that adds one of the key elements, in my view of things, to collapse of ancient states, which is the
Coming in
existence
from where?
from the south, probably.
Okay.
Chile. Having enemies at the gate, so to speak, seems to be one of the necessary factors in the collapse of ancient states, in my opinion. So you can suffer a huge drought, ecological catastrophe, you can suffer plant disease, plague, but if there's no one out there ready to move in and take advantage of that, these states seem to be able to survive. Furthermore, we have the case of Moche, where they had a huge El Nino flood that wiped out their canals and filled it with sediment. It didn't even miss a beat the first time. The second time, it seems to have been a major factor in the collapse of Moche. Could be that the religious legitimacy of the rulers was called into question. It could be a more simple economic factor, that they didn't have the wealth. There are a variety of explanations. In the case of Tiahuanaco, we can say there was a drought. We can say that the raised field, the agricultural productivity did collapse. We can say that there appear to be people coming in from elsewhere, but also there wasn't a biological collapse. There wasn't a demographic collapse. We have that from the archaeological
You mean
record.
there was a restructuring of the population, a movement of the population? Or?
Yeah, exactly. What you had is you go from a nucleated settlement, a very nucleated settlement of 50,000 people over 6 square kilometers, to a bunch of really small hamlets and villages. And see, that would make sense. You could probably speak to this better than I can, but once you get drought, a pastoral economy is a really excellent solution to a drought, because you can move the animals to water, you can't move the plants to water. And so what we see in the Lake Titicaca Basin at around 1100 AD is a reversion to more of a pastoral economy. We get about 20% of the population seems to be dedicated to pure pastoralism, as opposed to 5% under the Tiahuanaco period.
So how does the emergence of the famous Inca civilization relate to Tiahuanaco, or does it at all?
Oh, it does relate, certainly symbolically and ideologically. The Inca, who were Quechua speakers, remember, and the Tiahuanaco were probably Proto-Aymara speakers, 2 different language families entirely. The Inca placed a great deal of weight on having the genealogical legitimacy of Tiahuanaco. They established the Island of the Sun pilgrimage center that we talked about. All Inca emperors had to marry a woman from Tiahuanaco.
We know this from
historical fact. Yeah,
okay.
This is historically documented in a number of different sources. And remember, as an interesting aside, that the people who were writing this down were the Spanish priests, and they were very interested in statecraft and religion, so they took copious notes on this. So we know that the Inca placed a lot of emphasis on getting the legitimacy of their own empire from the Tiahuanaco. Now, there's a time gap there of several hundred years between the collapse of Tiahuanaco and the rise of the Inca. And if you look at the rise of the Inca state around the very late 13th, 14th century AD, you see that there were maybe a half dozen or so big kingdoms all through the Andes, up and down, competing with each other. Kind of a classic scenario in which you have maybe several dozen early on after the collapse of Wari and Tiahuanaco, and then you have a dozen, and then a few keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and then finally one wins, and they are so much larger than anybody else. That's the Inca. The Inca defeated the Chanca peoples up in their home territory, that they came racing down the Andean spine to conquer the Titicaca Basin. That was their first major conquest.
Now, the Inca is this huge empire, presumably much larger than Tiahuanaco.
Yes.
what sort of models can you use to explain the socio-political organization? I mean, can we use the old world systems model that we talked about for the Tiahuanaco that you thought didn't work? Does that work later in time?
Yes, I believe it works for the Inca much better. And I think when you have secondary or tertiary states like the Inca, you get different kinds of organization. In the first instance, the ideology of power is there. You look at the Holy Roman Empire with the post-Roman collapse. You have all these people calling themselves emperors and kings, and they were petty, very small, little, almost pathetically small political units, but the whole ideology of power was there. So with the collapse of Tiahuanaco and Wari and Moche, which I think had created these ideologies of power and rank and hierarchy and all this and that, it's much easier for these secondary and tertiary states to expand and reproduce this. So if you look at the Inca, in fact, you have that. They come in and they meet people who call themselves kings, but they sure don't look like kings archaeologically. They claim to be the equal of the Inca. They sit down and they drink from the golden goblet together. They exchange daughters together, so forth and so on. But archaeologically, they don't look anything like we would consider a state-level society, let alone an empire. So I think you have a lot of that. But that helps the Inca because now they're expanding. They're the biggest, most powerful, most well-organized military organization in the entire Andes, and there's nothing to stop them after they defeated the Chanca. They get to the Titicaca Basin, where they fight a huge war with the Coya people, and they defeat them. But they couldn't defeat the Lupaca people, who were further to the south. They then have an alliance with the Lupaca. The following king comes back, the emperor, Pachacuti, and he conquers the whole region.
Well, most people know that the Spaniards were really responsible for destroying the Inca civilization under Pizarro. How did that work? How was the small group of Spaniards able to take down one of the world's magnificent empires?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most fascinating questions, historical questions. There are a number of clear, unequivocal pieces of data that we can talk about. First, Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast around 1532. He started to move inland with 150 soldiers thereabouts, but he also, remember, had men of African origin who were slaves. He also had allies from Hispaniola join him. When we talk about the Spaniards, we're only talking about the men with horses and the infantry troops, but they had a lot more. So they probably had like maybe several hundred folks with them, which is a sizable army. Secondly, the horses. A horseman, fully armored, is the equivalent of a tank in World War I.
They didn't have horses in South America.
They did not have horses in South America. There's an interesting story that the Inca emperor, when he was hostage, said that he had planned to kill all the Spaniards, take their horses, breed them, and have a cavalry to meet them next time. It would have been very interesting historically. But the Spaniard on a horse was the greatest fighting man on earth at the time. They had fought in southern Spain, the expulsion of the Arabs. They were unquestionably the best person per person fighting outfit on earth. They arrived. These guys were petty nobility who had lots of titles and not a lot of money. They were desperate. A lot of middle-aged guys, like us, this is the last shot, this is it.
Right.
And they were committed. Now they moved in, and they strategically took advantage of all the people who hated the Incas. We sometimes have this false image that the Inca Empire, they were all one group who fought the Europeans. Well, that would be as if the Incas landed in Europe at the height of the Black Plague in 1380, let's say. No, you have French speakers, you have English speakers, you have German speakers. So the Spaniards arrived. They very, very, very adroitly took advantage of the political factions within the Inca Empire, had lots of allies who marched with them. So by the time they arrived to confront the Inca Emperor, Atahualpa, at the town of Cajamarca, they had an army of 10,000 loyal troops behind them who wanted to knock out Atahualpa. Furthermore, the Inca Empire was having a huge civil war. There were 4 armies in the field of 35,000 men each, but 2 armies were fighting the other 2 armies. And you had the government had split between Quito and Cusco, and the other emperor was captured and killed by Atahualpa. So the Spaniards basically took advantage of the diseases that came and cost maybe 30–40% mortality. They took advantage of the political intrigue and their military.
Well, Chip, that's a really depressing story. In closing, I'd just like to ask you, where do you think the future of our field, anthropology, is going in the next, let's say, decade?
Well, I think anthropology is one of the most vital sciences or scholarly pursuits we can have. Within anthropology, you know, we have our traditional four fields. Certainly archaeology, in my opinion, is thriving. We have no problem. We can survive institutionally within anthropology, where I think we belong, or outside of anthropology. I hope that we continue to have our four fields and maintain this contact, because the anthropological approach to history, to society, I think is the most powerful approach that we can have.
And how does UCLA deal with that?
Well, at UCLA we have a very strong commitment to the four-field approach in anthropology. We have a lot of faculty in biology and archaeology, linguistics, and sociocultural. We also have a PhD in archaeology that we grant through an interdepartmental program known as the Coates Institute of Archaeology. So we can survive quite well either way. We would prefer to stay, of course, firmly within anthropology.
Well, it sounds like archaeology is alive and very vibrant in UCLA and in South America with people like you. And I'd like to thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting me down to UC San Diego, which is one of the best anthropology programs in the country as well.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, the audience. Good night.